Welcome to the Madrona Group's 15-minute forms, where we talk about a form and hopes to get a better understanding of it. Today, I wanted to talk about Form 35, which is the Home Inspection Contingency. So what exactly is it? It is a contingency form that we can put into a contract for a buyer to gain access to the house or the property in order to inspect it or do whatever they need in order to get all the knowledge in order to move forward in the transaction. So the form looks like this. It's a 2-page form, and it is actually a contingency. When you include this in your contract, it is considered to be included in the contingencies. Now I'm going to go through the basics of why we use this form. I'm not necessarily going to go into a whole lot of detail about the ins and outs of inspections or responses, but I hope to give everybody a better understanding of when you think you should put this into a contract and what you're doing when you do. So looking at the form closer, we can see that it is actually a contingency that allows the buyer to enter the home and do any inspections that they deem necessary. This includes things like plumbers, electricians, home inspectors. The biggest thing to understand is if you have somebody come into the house to do an inspection, they need to be licensed in the field that they are professional in. So if you have a plumber come in or an electrician, they need to be a licensed plumber or a licensed electrician. Now, the buyer is also able to do their own inspection because it's the own buyer's eyes. But if you do a buyer inspection, warn your buyer that a professional should be used for some of these items unless your client has a specific specialty in what they are inspecting. Now, one of the options we can use with the home inspection is a sewer inspection. What this refers to is taking a scope down the pipelines and looking at the pipes of the home all the way out to either a septic system or into the city's sewer connection. If you choose to do something like this, the box needs to be checked for may in 1A. If you check may not, then the buyer may not remove toilets or remove caps in order to scope the sewer lines. Keep in mind, if you choose to do a scoping of the sewer, it's likely that you're going to be removing a toilet or opening up an access point, which has a special seal on it. And once that seal is removed, it cannot be replaced without replacing it new. So it's not possible for you to just take a toilet off, go look at it, and put it right back on, or open up an access valve, scope it out, and put it back on. A new seal has to be placed in there. If you have a buyer who's doing an inspection like this, I would let them know that does need to be done, because anytime we do an inspection, whatever part of the property is removed or potentially damaged has to be fixed or replaced by the buyer. It's the buyer's responsibility. Now, in the buyer's responsibility, all the inspections are going to be ordered by the buyer, performed by the buyer's choice of inspector, and fully completed at the buyer's expense. As you can see in paragraph 2, the buyer shall not alter the property or any improvements without obtaining the seller's permission. The permission to alter the property in the way of sewer scoping is done so by checking the box in 1A. And if any other modifications or damage to the property, removal of floorboards, walls, that all has to be run through the seller in order to inspect those places. Remember that the buyer is responsible for any damage that's caused during a home inspection. Now, this home inspection contingency applies to the home itself, and essentially, it gives the buyer a right to walk away from the purchase if anything is discovered that is something that they are not okay accepting. Now, the contingency does have a timeline. The timeline for the buyer's contingency or response for this contingency is going to be noted in paragraph 3. It defaults to 10 days. If on that 10th day, a buyer does not give any notice to that seller, whether they've chosen to move forward or back out or have any repairs done, it will be deemed waived, which means there's no more chance for negotiation on any of the repair work or anything discovered during the inspection. Now, before this timeline, the buyer is free to terminate the contract for any reason, And once they have that inspection report, if they choose to ask for repairs, those repairs must be asked for within the timeline specified in paragraph 3. The most important thing that we need to keep in mind, especially while representing buyers, is that any portion of the inspection report being delivered to the seller will waive the protection of the home inspection contingency. We must obtain seller's permission in order to send that report or any part of that report. Now, it's possible for us to pick up the phone and call the listing agent and say, hey, the buyer's concerned about XYZ. We would like to whatever. You're free to actually have a conversation regarding some of the buyer's concerns. However, no part of the inspection report can be given, no verbiage from the inspector, no list of items, nothing like that. What we want to do is we want to keep our inspection responses and our inspection conversations with the listing agent very minimal. Now, a seller can select one of these boxes if they see that a buyer has put in the inspection contingency. If the seller selects any of the boxes in section 4B, that is not considered a counteroffer. It is just considered the seller's request for the following items. Now, why would a seller request to see a portion of the report or any of these choices? The seller can consent to receive the entire inspection report. They can request to receive a portion that may be asked for with repairs, or if additional inspections are asked for by the buyer or not even asked for, the buyer does have the right to these if the inspector calls them out as necessary. The seller may ask to see proof that the home inspector did in fact request more inspections on certain items. When you are looking at the inspection contingency, check it once again after you've reached mutual acceptance to see if the seller has selected any of the boxes in paragraph 4. Now, the buyer does have the right to additional inspections if the inspector calls out that being necessary. An example of this would be a home inspector coming in and seeing a problem that involved something like plumbing. A home inspector is not a licensed plumber to be able to necessarily call out specific problems with that area. So in the inspection report, that inspector may write something to the effect of additional inspections required for this item. Now, the default time for the additional inspections is 5 days. If that's not modified and the buyer gives notice of additional inspections, the buyer will have 5 more days to get another home inspector in there that specializes in the area called out. Now, there is a caveat to this. If the buyer does their own home inspection, the buyer does not have the right to ask for their additional 5 days. It can only be asked for if a professional was brought in and that professional found something that exceeded the limit of their expertise. When a buyer chooses to ask for any modifications or repairs, the inspection contingency has timelines that are boilerplate timelines for responses. Make sure that you're checking these timelines because those are your negotiation times back and forth once you've given notice for the repairs. Now, this includes any response that is not an acceptance or denial of that inspection report. So, once a formal notice has been given for a request from the seller, the default time to respond is 3 days. Default time for the buyer to respond to the seller's answer to those is another 3 days. These timelines will not just keep going. These are specific timelines to the date of delivery. Now, once a notice has been given or a modification request has been given, the party sending that request needs to wait until the other party responds within their given timeline. Once you've sent over that list, whether it be a price reduction, an ask for a repair, or something along the lines of either of those two things, you cannot change your mind. You cannot renegotiate. You have to wait till the other party has a chance to respond. At the end of those timelines, once the buyer has seen what the seller has to say about their request, the buyer will have their 3 days to decide how they want to proceed. That third paragraph, 6B, that third section of negotiation is the final day that the buyer has to decide if they're willing to move forward with the transaction, accept what the seller has to say, or walk away. Now, if repairs are agreed to with the inspection response, the default time for the seller to complete those repairs is 3 days prior to the closing date. Sometimes repairs need to be done before to the closing date. As we all know, 3 days prior to the closing date, if you have repairs that have to be done because they may be a lender requirement, you may consider modifying paragraph 7 to match up and meet the needs of your client. The Form 35 also makes note of oil storage tanks. This is not a common thing that you'll find, but in some older homes, oil was used to heat the house, and those tanks may be present on the property. So if you have an oil storage tank, that's going to require some sort of inspection and make sure that it is not doing anything with ground contamination. And if you want to make sure that the buyer is safe from anything being called out from an oil tank, make sure that it does not go into the ground at all and it's above ground. If you have a septic system, that's considered an on-site sewage disposal system. Now, the septic system cannot be inspected or negotiations made on that solely based on the 35. If you have a septic system, you're going to want to add an additional addendum to your contract. And depending on the location of where the house is, it may be a 22S, which is the standard septic addendum, or it may be specific to the county the house is in. Number 10 is a neighborhood review contingency. This is something that can be checked if the buyer has questions or concerns about the neighborhood itself. Perhaps it's on a busy street, or perhaps it's in an area that gets very crowded and they don't know if they'll be able to have parking. Anything that they want to do to investigate the neighborhood itself, different traffic patterns, noise, things like that. The buyer has the right to add that additional contingency. There's also a neighborhood contingency form, but if your client has a home inspection contingency, the buyer can also just use that time to discover all the things about the home and the property that may or may not work for them. So what are the benefits of using a home inspection contingency? Number one, the benefit for a seller is to go into the transaction knowing that the buyer has full access of all knowledge on the home. The buyer will not have anything left on the seller's shoulders. We are a buyer beware state, so this gives the buyer the opportunity to find out anything they need to find out and not base their transactions solely on a seller's disclosure, leaving your seller in a position that may get them in trouble in the future if something's not disclosed. What are some cautions about using the home inspection contingency? In a competitive market, a home inspection contingency gives the buyer an out. And an out without necessary cause. It's the buyer's basically get out of jail free card. So for a seller to see a home inspection contingency in a competitive market, they may shy away from an offer that has that over one that does not. So you need to weigh out the pluses and minuses when it comes to crafting your offer. Now, as a seller, even in a competitive market, if you want to give the buyer the opportunity to discover the things they need to put all the responsibility back on the buyer, I would strongly suggest allowing an inspection contingency, but in the competitive situation you may be in, shortening the timelines. An inspection contingency is not something that we can just do and say, we'll just pass or fail this. If an inspection contingency is in a contract, a buyer has the right to ask for repairs, modifications, price reductions. The buyer has the right to all the things the inspection contingency offers, even though the seller may not be willing to do anything up ahead of time. There's no sale if there's an inspection contingency, and there's no pass-fail if there's an inspection contingency. Why do we put it in there? Do we even have the right to enter the property once we're mutual if we don't have something in there saying the buyer has the right to inspect? The answer is no. We do not have the right to go back into a property after mutual acceptance if the buyer is not given permission in written form. This inspection contingency is the seller's permission for the buyer to enter the property after mutual acceptance in written form. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions about the inspection contingency or how to use it, please reach out to your managing broker.